Greetings and welcome once again to the Gaming Codex, the show where I try to explain to you all the various words and terms used within video games and the video games industry. And today's term is that of first-person shooter or FPS. And what would that be? Well, according to the general definition, the first-person shooter is a video game genre centered around gun and other weapon-based combat in a first-person perspective. That is, the player experiences the action through the eyes of the protagonist. To many, the first-person shooter ever made is Doom. It's understandable why some would say that. It was the game that defined what the modern first-person shooter was for a while until Halo came along and said, let's have regenerating stuff and just do guns. And then Call of Duty came along and said, let's make them boring. But Doom is far from being the first one of its genre. Some would say it was Wolf 3D. I mean, after all, it is the one that preceded Doom and the one that is sort of the grandfather of the genre. And they would also be wrong. Some would say that it was actually Hover Tank 3D or Catacomb 3D or any of the other games that its software made at the beginning of the 90s. Well, not really. The concept of the first-person shooter traces its roots way back to the 70s to really old games like Maze, where that sure may not really conform to the idea we have now of first-person shooter, you know, with a lot of power pickups, a lot of different weapons, a lot of varied types of levels and customization and occasionally quick-time events and story, but they very well respect the definition of what a first-person shooter is. It's a game where you shoot stuff, and you're experiencing it through the eyes of the character that you are inhabiting. Everything else that Doom and Wolfenstein 3D establish, like the excellent level design, the focus on navigational puzzles, the reward that comes with that part of the game, not just the annoyance of it, is just icing on the cake, as you would say, or the cherry on top. But that sort of poses a very interesting question, which is tied into the popular definition of what an FPS is. And that would be anything first person is an FPS, isn't it? I mean, when you break it right down, if it's first person and it does have some combat in it, isn't it an FPS? I mean, it's not about having a gun in the game that shoots stuff, it's about having something that shoots stuff to eradicate the enemies. So it could even be spells as long as they are treated more like guns rather than, you know, magics that take you like 3 hours to put together and then use once and they blow up everything, but they're really slow to use. Well, that all boils down to exactly what the core of the game is. Take for example Ultima Underworld, which precedes Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. You do have the option of, you know, killing stuff by shooting them at a distance with both spells that can act like, you know, guns for instance, or you can use ranged weapons that are absolutely, you know, something that would fit in an FPS. We do have a bunch of FPS that use bows right now, or crossbows as weapons, because, you know, you're in the future. Why else would you use something other than a bow instead of, I don't know, a giant plasma rifle? But would Ultima Underworld be an FPS? And the answer is no, because the core of Ultima Underworld was to be an immersive simulation and an RPG. The first-person shooting part was just that. A part, a tool, a means that you could optionally use to achieve your goal. And the same thing goes for a lot of other games that try to be a bit more than just shooters. A great example of this is Deus Ex, which, yeah, you can absolutely say that it is an FPS. It looks like an FPS, it behaves like an FPS if you play it like one. But at its core, it is an RPG based around the idea of giving you the choice of how you play. So in that aspect, it is more an RPG that can take the shape of an FPS. And when we're talking about things that really did not have the, you know, option of actual ranged combat in first person, and I mean true ranged combat, like Thief, that's not an FPS at all. Yeah, you can kill people with an arrow in Thief, but really, you're better off just dousing the torches with a water arrow and leaving people alone, because you're gonna get killed. Because combat is not the focus of that game at all, unless it's a really stupid sequel. Same goes for things like Portal, which, although feature combat-ish encounters, they're more about stuff shooting at you and you're trying to figure out in creative ways how to deal with that without actually having a weapon of your own to fire back and instantly destroy the enemy. You have a portal gun that lets you modify the terrain. Yeah, it's called a gun, but let's face it, it's not gonna fire bullets or lasers at anybody. Well, it can be used to redirect both bullets and lasers, but that's a whole other matter. So in itself is not a first-person shooter, it's a first-person puzzler. So that leads us to the marketing definition. Can we make everything an FPS? The fact of the matter is that the FPS is really popular, and it's been really popular for years. It's an easy enough recipe to get right enough so that people will still find it enjoyable no matter how much like the Medal of Honor reboot it is, which was a terrible set of games. And the reason people play FPS games is just the bare bones basic concept of it. It's not honestly even what Doom added on top of that. It's not about the interesting levels, it's not about the exhilaration of exploration, it's just about spectacle. It's something really easy that draws the player in, unless the player has, gotten fed up with the genre and never plays it again until like Doom comes out or something, the other one I mean. And there has been this tendency to make everything an FPS, even things that weren't FPSs and should probably have never been FPSs, but they made them FPSs. And also things that were not FPSs but really benefited from becoming one, like Duke Nukem 3D. The 2D games were really not all that interesting, honestly, but when it became an FPS, instant glory. Also, it doesn't hurt that it was really good. Doing the same to Fallout though, maybe not the greatest thing possible. It was dialed back a bit in Fallout 3, but in 4 it looks a bit umphed up, and it does look like it will stay that way. Because, well, let's face it, it'll sell more. And in the end, that's what it's all about. So closes another edition of the Gaming Codex. Come back next time when we will talk about a brand new subject. Goodbye.